Good. Welcome to everybody, but most of all to Marleen Oet, who is joining us for the second time, but this time on a public session about the Decoding the China Dictionary. This is the report. We come to that later. Also joining us from France is Ingrid de Hooge, our colleague, and right here sitting next to me, also without lunch was not delivered, is Rogier Kramer. So we are here, the four of us, looking forward to getting very critical questions from you, but not without having introduced the topic. Marleen, last spring your institute published a very intriguing report, and for the audience, if you have not been able to read it yet, I wholeheartedly recommend that you do afterwards, because the report is a huge source of reference for those who try to get a better understanding on why Chinese diplomacy meets so often with grave irritation, notably in the West. Especially the use of a great many of long-standing notions from the post-war diplomacy can drive Western diplomats up the wall. Chinese diplomats seem to have found a way in twisting the meaning of some of these crucial terms, like freedom of speech and rule of law, to make it sound as if Western diplomats get it all wrong, and that by giving these terms a new and foremost Chinese context, the Chinese diplomats seem to be much better tuned in with the international reality as it is today. And by analyzing 14 of these key terms by referencing to original Chinese party sources and government sources, Marleen and her colleagues are explaining how this, you could almost say, parallel vocabulary has come about. Marleen, if I could start with you, and thank you again for joining us, could I ask you to say a little bit more about the background of this development that we have seen over the past 2 decades or so?
Thank you very much, Lily, and great to be joined by two fellow China specialists or China nerds, Ingrid and Rogier. I really look forward to hearing your comments and feedback on our humble effort here, which I should say, I mean, it was, the idea came about, we're a group of China specialists based in Berlin and Stockholm, and we thought of providing this dictionary or tool as a simple and practical tool to help European policymakers decipher the Chinese diplomatic discourse. And the purpose is really to enable more informed engagement with China, because we've found that the debate over how to and whether to engage with China is based on rather superficial assumptions and platitudes really about China. And we want to show here, showcase the importance of actually reading Chinese documents, which not everyone is able to do. So we're doing that for you or for them. It is really important to, while we invoke the same concepts as China at the UN, concepts like rule of law and democracy, good governance and so forth, there are fundamental differences in how liberal democracies in Europe or in the US define these terms as compared to China. China has, since reform and opening up started in 1979, these concepts that originated perhaps in liberal democracies in the West, such as human rights and democracy, have filtered into Chinese discourse, but taken on a new meaning. So there's two processes that have been going on. One is that China is, with its growing power and influence and its desire to increase its global discourse power, China is exporting some Chinese concepts such as shared destiny of mankind, but also importing, redefining and integrating these more international terms to make them more compatible with the Chinese political and ideological system.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you very much. No doubt people will have questions, especially those who read the report, and they are encouraged to ask those questions via the chat function. So I will have to look at this monitor now and then and see what questions will pop up. But before we go to the Q&A session, of course, we have Ingrid and Rogier, whom I've asked to select 3 notions each. They're popular notions, if I may say so, and with which they have, of course, affluent experience in doing business with the Chinese. Both of them have been doing research in China and on China for decades. Rogier, you're the youngest. Can I even say decades already? Or yes, decades. It's decades. And Ingrid, of course, has been very senior, the most senior person in the room. That is a nice way of saying a good thing about somebody, and especially for women, insulting them beyond anything they had ever experienced. Ingrid, I will start therefore with you. You selected 3 notions. They are freedom of opinion, democracy, and human rights. And you will take one first, then I will switch on to Rogier, and so we will do this a couple of times. Say what you have felt of help in reading the analysis by Malin and her colleagues, and how you, in those past decades, encountered or collected experiences which point more or less in the same direction, or perhaps in an entirely different, maybe even opposite direction. Ingrid, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Let me first congratulate Malin with his very timely publication, and also, of course, all the contributors to this Decoding China Dictionary. I think it is a mandatory reading for all those collaborating with China, not only diplomats, but also academics, business people, and so on, who are often not so familiar with Chinese concepts or with the Chinese reinterpretation, Chinese understanding of these concepts. And this is important because China is much more than before very active in promoting their own reinterpretation of those values that lie at the heart of our liberal world order. And they redefine them to fit into their own Chinese Communist Party narratives. And in that way, they remove them from our liberal values. So this is a really very important work. The first concept I'm invited to say a little bit about is freedom of opinion. Now, this is a very broad concept which cannot be separated from freedom of expression and freedom of press. And the Chinese officials, the Chinese government says, well, we do have freedom of speech and press. It is even in our constitution. And that is indeed the case. But they say also something else. They add that there's freedom of speech as long as it doesn't damage China's national interests, China's national security, and this includes the security of the party and the security of the position of Xi Jinping. And it should also not interfere with China's national positive image. So officials in China say freedom of expression does not equal free expression. The government and media should be guided, should guide public opinion to ensure stability and security in China. And let me highlight 3 developments that I see in my own research, how this works out. Firstly, I see a restrictive approach to freedom of expression that has intensified in 2 ways. The first is that the array of topics that is now considered sensitive has broadened, and then also per topic, for each topic, the room of debate, the room of expression has been restricted, further restricted than, let's say, 10 years ago. Secondly, I see that the Chinese government uses freedom of expression also as a tool to attack the foreign media by saying that it is a cover or an excuse for the foreign media to disseminate fake news and to smear China, to maliciously attack China, in their own words. Thirdly, I see that China is trying to impose restrictions on freedom of expression, not only within their own country, but also abroad. And recently we've seen examples of that by the sanctions that China imposed on European academics, European journalists, and European think tanks, such as the German China think tank, MERIX. Let me stop here and give now the floor to Rogier.
Many thanks, Ingrid, for taking care of the time. Rogier, it's yours.
Yes, and thank you very much. And before I go into my first topic of choice, the rule of law, I would just like to commend Malin and her team on this effort and also outline a bit why I think it's important. And that is, I was in a workshop with Adam Tooze a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that we were discussing is that one of the problems that China presents us with intellectually is that it is really subversive, not just in terms of challenging our own values, but in challenging the entire conceptual library that we have in understanding, you know, what is a state, what is a society. We think we know what that is and that it's sort of the same everywhere in the world. And China presents us with the harsh reality that it may well not be. And, you know, there are important historical reasons for this. We should never forget that China is one of the very few countries in the world that was never occupied or colonized by the West. So it doesn't have a history of legacy institutions that most other countries in the world who either are Western or are ex-Western colonies do have. And the second thing is that China historically has never been a Christian state. And very many of the concepts that we deal with are ultimately Christian in origin, right? The idea of sovereignty, for instance, originates from theological ideas of the notions of power and the relationship between kings and the Pope. And it sort of goes on from there. So it isn't just, it would be, I think, unwise to just say, this is a narrative or rhetorical ploy by the Communist Party of China to essentially, how shall I put it, Baudelarize or to deform these ideas that we have just for their political purposes, right? There's something more in there. And in some cases, not all, but in some cases, there is a clear logic and, you know, quite some fairly commonsensical ideas in there. So from that perspective, what I really hope this dictionary does is help people understand that the world through the eyes of Chinese political leaders looks differently. And in some cases, we might not like what we see, but the importance of China is such that we cannot avoid the fact that that perspective exists, and we therefore need to, you know, understand one's adversary. And you see this very clearly in my first topic of choice, the notion of rule of law, where for us, rule of law is something that really comes in terms of the depersonification of power, right? We start building the rule of law in various European states at the end of the 19th century to do away with vestiges of the ancien regime, right? To take away more personal power from kings or from aristocracy or guilds. And we create a public sphere, which we call the modern state, and that state is created through law, which is why we have constitutions, and it operates through law, right? So in a way, the state is an empty vessel where we have laws delimiting what the people who are in temporary charge of the state can and cannot do, but also laws are the tool through which they govern. And in China, this is different. And in China, you have a communist party with a historical sense of mission. The state is not an empty vessel. The state is a vehicle for the Communist Party to achieve a historical program. And law is therefore a tool, right? So the Chinese state isn't a creature of law. It does create law. The interesting thing is that if you look at some bits of it, there are aspects of rule of law that are common, right? Part of what rule of law does also in the Chinese context is control the state, albeit at the local level, the individual official and the actions that they do. It isn't the state qua state, right? The state isn't supposed to operate within the consent of the governed, as in a liberal democracy, but the state is supposed to not be disempowered and limited, but to be empowered and capable of realizing that program. But what we very interestingly see with rule of law in the Chinese definition is that means that you have to really, really thread a needle carefully between laying things down in law and therefore generating predictability and certainty, and maintaining the discretion that the Chinese leadership needs in order to realize its purposes.
Okay, very clear. Thank you. Malin, you're taking notes, I assume, all the time.
I am, and maybe I can come in and just comment very briefly on Roger's and Ingrid's really important points here. Because I think what Roger alludes to a little bit is that, I mean, there's not only an ideological iceberg beneath these terms from a Chinese perspective, but also from our Western liberal perspective. And the sooner we can sort of give up the idea that these are politically neutral concepts. I mean, democracy, obviously not, but even terms like multilateralism and rule of law, and many of these terms that we have included in the dictionary have really strong ideological basis, also in the West. So I definitely agree with that, Roger. And I think China's challenge to how we define these international norms, it is not easily dismissed because of China's positioning itself as a representative or leader of the developing world, of the third world, that is sort of struggling against the imperialist West. And I think that framing is something we have to take seriously, because it is quite effective at the UN. So related to freedom of speech and of opinion, I mean, China is saying that we need to respect China's right to speak. It sees this right as a right that the Chinese state has, rather than a right that individuals have in relation to the state. So the way China frames the discussion is very much as a struggle that China is taking on against imperialistic Western powers. And it's quite an attractive discourse to a large part of the world. I think also relatedly this year, the Communist Party has its 100th anniversary. So this discourse and this propaganda domestically will only get more and more intense this year. The discourse around China's having suffered 100 years of humiliation, and now China is standing up. China also, one phrase is that China has suffered three things. So one, it's been beaten, beida, and it's been starved, and it's been cursed, yelled at. And now it's solved the two first problems. It's no longer beaten, it's no longer starving, but it still has some work to do to gain discourse power and to have a say, and to not be criticized or cursed by the West.
Okay, clear. I'm quite sure Rogier would love to respond, but we will limit his freedom of expression in this respect because we have so many more things to do, but he can come back in the Q&A section. And now it's back to France, 12 points. Ingrid, your next notion, your next concept is, well, maybe the broadest of all, is democracy.
Yes, indeed. And if I can just add a little bit to what Malin had said, in this slide, it is very interesting that last weekend, the Politburo of the Communist Party held a study session on discourse power, on raising China's discourse power and also raising China's discourse system. So we will see even more of this promotion at home both and abroad of Chinese understandings of all kinds of concepts, including that of democracy. And here again, the Chinese government says, well, we have democracy in China. And President Xi Jinping even said, China's socialist democracy is the most comprehensive, genuine, and effective democracy. China says, well, we have only a different type of democracy. Our type is a consultative democracy, or the latest term that's being promoted is a whole process democracy. And that means that China follows all kinds of procedures and laws to gather public opinion, to talk to the people, ask what they think, and they use that input to make their policies. Of course, they leave out what is not in their interest. And this new term, whole process democracy, is here to stay because it was written into a new law at the last National People's Congress in March. Of course, this Chinese understanding of democracy must be distinguished from our understanding of democracy, which is very much about separation of powers and an independent judiciary. And that is, of course, not available in China. China even thinks these ideas are subversive and they should be guarded against. In the very famous document number 9, a Chinese policy document published in 2013, liberal democracy was defined as a threat to regime stability in China. Currently, Chinese intellectuals are saying, well, that Western type of democracy is just a passing model in history. It will not be here to stay. If you look at the new narratives of China, you see that they are used to provide ideological legitimacy for China's political system. For example, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, but also around the globe. And with this new narrative, China seeks to counter liberal democracy, but also to counter the perception that China is a threat to democracy and that China is this systemic rival. So on the one hand, it says, well, it's just a passing thing and we have the better model. And on the other hand, they still try to present themselves as a democracy, namely a better democracy. And maybe one last comment, especially in the past 2-3 months, we see a lot of discourse, propaganda on democracy in China. And we saw that in particular around the National People's Congress in March, when the 14th 5-year plan was launched. And this was promoted as an illustration of how democratic the process around writing that policy plan was. So that we will see much more about this Chinese interpretation of democracy in the months and years to come.
Okay, thank you very much. We go straight away to Rogier, who has chosen as his second notion, good governance.
Exactly. And, obviously we planned this a little bit in advance because good governance and democracy are obviously very closely related, particularly in the post-Cold War context. And I've chosen good governance because it's really something that helps us in dealing with some of these intellectual issues. Because good governance obviously refers to competence. Now, in the post-Cold War context, what we've done intellectually is we've divided the world into 2 bits, the democratic world and the non-democratic world. And essentially what we say is democracies are morally good, therefore they are legitimate and strong, but they are also competent, right? Democracies do better policies, whereas non-democratic states are morally worse, therefore they do not have legitimacy and are weak, but they are also incompetent because the very non-democratic nature of the system means that decisions cannot be taken in a competent manner. Now, from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party, what the party is trying to say is, or trying to do, is derive a lot of its legitimacy from competence, from generating economic growth, obviously most prominently in the years after 1989, but also by now solving social problems, dealing with environmental pollution, delivering on many other categories of welfare. And then obviously you need a more capable state of doing that. And when you look at Chinese language policy documents, and the Decoding China Dictionary does a good job of sort of providing some initial starting points. This is what a lot of upgrading of Chinese government capability is about, right? We think about the government's use of digital technology, and immediately we think about surveillance, and obviously that's an important part of it. But it's also about long distance education, long distance healthcare, other social services, about monitoring environmental pollutions and providing solutions to problems. And the problem that we have here is that very often we have the problem that because we assume that democracies are competent and non-democracies aren't, we very often overestimate our own competence at the same time as we underestimate the competence of the Chinese government, as well as the seriousness with which Beijing takes competent governance. And obviously, for all the problems that there are, corruption, misinvestment, political fragmentation, obviously they exist. And we should study them, but we should not only study them, because that leads exactly to this problem of underestimation. And we forget that in very, very many ways, the Chinese government is certainly, for a government at that development level, if you look at GDP per capita, is far more competent than it very often gets credit for.
Okay, thank you very much. Malin, you want to come in on this for both Rogier and Ingrid?
Yeah, just maybe, I mean, this is a very topical topic, obviously, because of the pandemic. So did democracies in the end, or authoritarian countries like China deal with the pandemic better? That is a debate that's ongoing. And at the National People's Congress in March this year, the phrase that sort of the West is in declining chaos, while China is orderly and rising, was popular, and of course with the chaos at Capitol Hill in January, this also really gave food to that narrative in China, that the Chinese model of governance is superior to the Western democratic chaos in dealing with public health challenges, and that China should be self-confident. That is also a big important part of the current narrative and propaganda in China, that China will no longer accept being criticized or having the West pointing their fingers with their bellies full. As Xi Jinping said when he was vice president in Mexico, he said that Westerners who have their bellies full and who are bored have nothing better to do than point their fingers at China. So I think China's message now is that we, and it started already with the financial crisis of 2008, that China said that we can be confident in the Chinese model, and we will no longer accept criticism from the West. Indeed, now, I mean, China even has started conditioning cooperation and dialogue with the West on that we don't criticize China for its human rights record.
Okay, good. And I think your remarks cover also what Ingrid said about democracy. I mean, it's really interrelated. Okay, then we turn to the last two concepts that we are going to discuss, and then I hope that the audience will come forward with Q&A, or at least with the questions. So far I haven't seen anything in the chat, so you better make haste. But first we turn to Ingrid, who's also going to tackle a very interesting notion, namely that of human rights.
Indeed, very important, getting less attention in the past year also with the COVID narrative, but not in China. China says, well, human rights, it's also in the Chinese constitution. It's a term they have embraced, not initially, but soon they thought it was better to embrace them and change the concept instead of fighting it. But China has made clear it has a very different understanding of human rights. China says, and this is due to China's historical conditions and very different situation in the Chinese view. China says the foremost human rights are the right to subsistence and the right to development, and political and civil rights are secondary to maintaining stability and harmony. It's also a comment that is made often in China's COVID-19 narrative. Furthermore, China says human rights are considered or should be considered a country's internal affairs, and not something that others can discuss. It's not a legitimate concern of the international community. And they have no right to interfere into a country's internal affairs and discussing this so-called human rights. What do I see back of this this in my own research? Well, I see both in China's narrative and in Chinese actions. The narrative at home, China wants its people to believe that there is no government in the world that cares so much about the well-being of its people than the Chinese government. You see that back in the COVID narrative, as Malin just has discussed, but you, for example, see it also in all kinds of things that happened around the world 2 years ago with the very serious forest fires in the United States and Australia. A Chinese newspaper wrote, well, in these countries, the government leaves people in their house to die in the fire. But we here in China, we would never do such a thing because we care so much about human rights. So that's a very strong element. You also see it back in the narrative around Xinjiang, where China says, well, our re-education campaigns, they are to protect the human rights of the people in Xinjiang. So they're turning it around. What do I see back in terms of actions? Well, I studied China's diplomacy, and over the past 20 years, I've seen an enormous expansion of China's foreign service, but also the quality of diplomats. And they have become very good at playing the international game on human rights. And in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, they now play a very dominant role. And they are able to avoid China critical resolutions from being passed, from being adopted. And they also more and more succeed in getting their own concept, their own understanding of human rights into these resolutions. I think this is very serious. It's very difficult to counter. Meanwhile, we do see the human rights situation in China, in Hong Kong deteriorating. So also my discussion for, or my question for the discussion is how can we counter this? How can we defend ourselves against this new Chinese diplomacy?
Okay, thanks, Ingrid. Rogier, the reluctance of China to accept interference from the West in terms of human rights brings us to your third notion, the one of sovereignty.
Yes, and I've written a report all about that, at least in cyberspace, for those among the audience suffering from insomnia. But indeed, sovereignty is indeed the counterpoint to human rights. Obviously, sovereignty has many angles that I think the Decoding China entry does a very good job in sort of laying out, talking about geographical space, right? What is China's role in the South China Sea, for instance? But I think we really have to think about where does sovereignty come from and why does China want it that badly? And one of the answers is, you know, for all the instrumentalization of the century of humiliation, we shouldn't forget that it actually happened. And that, as always, there's really interesting psychological research on aggression and victimhood. And it is that victims tend to remember aggression better and longer than the aggressors do, right? For the average Jewish person, the Holocaust is a far bigger thing than for the average German person, because the average German person wants to move on, it's in the past. And for the average Jewish person, it may well be more of a, they did it before, they can do it again. And if they do it, it's going to have a fairly major impact on my life. And a similar thing, I think, happens with the century of humiliation, where China, once upon a time a fairly prosperous and powerful empire, was reduced through imperial intervention, the Opium Wars, and so on and so forth. And so, for starters, sovereignty is about self-determination. It's about making sure that no one ever will be powerful enough to tell China to do things that it doesn't want to do, right? And that's really where it comes from. Now, obviously, by now you also have the big power. The big power myopia that you get on the Chinese side. I'm sure we remember Yang Jiechi, then foreign minister, I think at the APEC summit a couple of years ago, telling other countries in Asia, we're a big country and you're just smaller countries, and that's the way the world works. Perhaps, I'm saying this as a citizen of Belgium. I hope it doesn't. But I think more broadly, this is really one of the points where we have to think about the fact that some of these ideas have a fairly understandable basis. And there is something to it where China, I think, has correctly diagnosed at least the notion that we have, where we say, states can be sovereign only insofar as they accept particular versions of truth. Now, historically, the problem with sovereignty is that we've gotten it in Europe to solve religious war, right? We developed sovereignty as a concept to be able to disagree on matters of moral truths in order to sort of develop peaceful coexistence. And, obviously it hasn't prevented World War I, II, or indeed many other conflicts, but in the end, sovereignty is about coexistence while disagreeing on matters of moral truth. And the problem with things like universal values, human rights, whatever you want, is that they bring that notion of universal moral truth back into politics through the back door. And this is really the big question of our time, right? If China steadfastly refuses to adopt a version of human rights that we consider to be universally applicable and true, can we still coexist with them? And this, I think, at the heart of hearts, is going to be the fundamental question guiding our international politics over the next couple of decades, where we should also start taking into account how much we have outsourced things to China that we didn't want to do anymore, and therefore have become dependent on China, and that indeed moving away from that would mean a serious hit to our own way of life, which I haven't really heard many people talk about in any serious way, but I think we really should.
Okay, thank you, Rogier. Before turning to the Q&A, and Christian Straube has a very interesting question which links to this last remark, I would like to give the floor to Malin to comment on the two last notions that we have been discussing.
Yes, and I think it relates a bit to one of the questions in the chat, maybe from Christian, actually, as you pointed out. Yeah. So I think what can we do, as Ingrid said, I think so two things that are really making this debate about universality and human rights impossible now, and it's not only because of China, is relativism and whataboutism. So relativism in the sense that different states, countries, governments pick and choose from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Human Rights Conventions, as if it was a menu that you could choose which rights you will respect and protect and which you won't. So China has ratified several human rights treaties, but not the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Other important states, such as the United States, has only ratified the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, but not the one on the economic, social, and cultural rights. So I think one major effort that we all could do is to just regard human rights as universal and ratify all the treaties. So not just civil and political rights or just economic and social rights, but all of them as they are indivisible and universal. And then there's the whataboutism that really plagues any meaningful discussion on human rights, where country A will go, well, China, if China's criticized about the human rights situation in Xinjiang, it will say, well, the US had slaves, or Germany had Nazism and concentration camps. And then that's sort of that kills the discussion. That's not a meaningful way to move human rights protection forward. So let's stop with the relativism and the whataboutism. And I think that would be a very positive step forward.
Okay, good. And then directly on to the first question. I mean, you already referred to it. Christian Staub is arguing that it's very easy to get diverging opinions on these kind of notions. How would it be for you to work on notions that might bridge the gap between China and the rest of the Western world if it comes to international governance and that sort of matters?
Well, I maybe I don't understand the question fully, but one thing I wanted to say also that I forgot just now is that when we talk about the Chinese definition in our dictionary, we are talking about the Chinese Communist Party definition of these terms. So it's a bit sloppy of me now to speak of the Chinese definition and China's definition, because what we mean is the official Chinese Communist Party definition of these terms. And that is relevant and interesting, not the least in relation to human rights and how we define human rights, because actually the committee that drafted the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was composed of a very diverse group of diplomats and experts, including a Chinese diplomat. So I mean, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was defined also by China by way of a Chinese diplomat.
Yes, I could say something to this, but as a moderator, I will refrain from it. But I think the universality of the world has changed a little bit since 1943 when the work first started. But this is for another session. I mean, you are alluding to something that is also being asked by Gabriel Wagner. How can we be sure that the interpretation of the Chinese official documents that you have used, obviously both party and government, is Chinese or leader specific? I mean, it is a guess. He's saying we cannot look into the head of Xi Jinping. So how do we know that it is Chinese?
I don't know. I'm not sure I understand the question, but I mean, all of us who have worked on the dictionary, what you see in the dictionary are very brief definitions so that policymakers will read them, but they are based on decades of studying Chinese speeches, documents, leaders, Chinese Communist Party leaders' speeches and law, and so it's not just picking a random speech by a Chinese person and then pretending like this is the Chinese definition. It's based on decades between us, 100 years of research on Chinese law and policy. So I think it is fair, but I don't know if Roger, if you agree, whether you think the way we define or describe the Chinese definitions, if it's fair, and whether you think it's based on relevant sources in the dictionary.
Fair warning, I am a committed relativist, which is also why it's fun to debate these matters, right? But on the quality of your research, I have nothing to add. It is very good. I mean, obviously, you know, the dictionary tries to do something for a sort of audience that I tend to refer to as well-educated non-specialists. So we could have extremely long debates about this, but that's not what this dictionary tries to achieve. And I think what the dictionary does try to do, it does extremely well. More broadly, you know, when is something Chinese? I mean, I get so tired of these conceptual, like, is China still communist? Yada, yada, yada. It's atrocious. But I will say there are some common pitfalls. And one of the common pitfalls is to say that there is anything Chinese, right? It reminds me of during the Trump administration, I would have so many friends in the United States who would tell me what Trump is doing is un-American. But the point is, no, he's in charge of the country. So for the four next years, whatever American foreign policy is Trumpian foreign policy. So, you know, you can't have this essentialism where we say somewhere there is a Platonic ideal of a Chinese definition of concepts. That is not what the Communist Party does, because the Communist Party is this evil political organization that is only thinking after its own power. Well, maybe it is, but it's also an organization that is building on millennia of Chinese political tradition, and there are some clear trends there, and there are some clear divergences there. And you can see this. You can say similar things about what's happening on politics in Taiwan, which obviously is also deeply rooted in empirical Chinese political history. Or then there's the notion that we say, you know, the Communist Party of China has its own thing, but the people of China disagree. And again, you know, that's not the point. This is a Leninist political organization that runs the country. So if you want to know what the Chinese state is doing, the people don't really matter that much. In the same way that, you know, whatever the people in the US think doesn't really matter that much as long as Trump is in charge, or when the shoe is on the other foot, when Biden is in charge, right? I think it is perfectly legitimate to say, you know, this is the Communist Party of China, and one big difference is between the CCP and most other political systems, apart from the fact that it is, I believe, now the longest lasting single party system in recent global history, yeah. But it meticulously manages ideology and concepts and, you know, the intellectual toolkit of government. I am not aware of any other political organization in any other major country that does it to the degree of depth and profundity that the Chinese Communist Party does. And so for us as researchers, that makes our life actually really easy, because there's just a corpus of works out there where the Communist Party thinks long and hard and publicly, in a way that is accessible to those of us that speak Mandarin, about what all of this means and how it changes. And that is something that, you know, people like Malin, myself, and many others track over time. If we want to know what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, usually it's very good at telling us.
It is. Ingrid, you have the same experience, because you make use of all kind of government and also, of course, party documents in your own research.
Yes, indeed. Well, what I would like to add is that the development of these concepts is quite steady in China. There are no big fluctuations. You see them gradually developing, changing over time, but it is very easy to trace this development. And indeed, as Rogier said, much is published, especially in party journals. You can really follow it very closely. Furthermore, everything that is published officially in China has the official approval of the Communist Party. So, you know, it is not, it's not easy to publish fake news in that sense in official journals in China. So I have exactly the same experience.
Okay, let's go on to the next question, and that is about the European strategic narrative. The question is, where is that right now, and should we have one, and how convincing can that be? So this person is pleading to have a European strategy narrative next to the Chinese, or maybe opposite to the Chinese strategy narrative. Malin, do you think the European Commission would be up to that task?
Well, I think it is. This is a question that's come up several times, actually, whether we should sort of construct, now that China is putting so much effort and money into building a Chinese narrative and telling China's story well, and building a discourse system that is favorable to China. Should we build a counter narrative, sort of a European or even a Western democratic narrative? I think it's very hard, because, I mean, we don't work that way in democracies. That's the sort of the very definition of a democracy, is that there are many voices and many narratives. And we don't work with public diplomacy in the way that China does, where sort of there's a united front composed of all of China, the party and the state, the party state, civil society, all speaking in one voice. It's top down, and there's no room for sort of diverting or dissenting opinions. I think to do something like that in Europe would be very, very hard. So if that's what is meant by the question, then I think it's hard. But I mean, I on the other hand, I think it's necessary for us to sort of not focus so much on the narrative, but maybe proving how democracy is more effective and better, a better governance model. I think that would be good. Yeah.
Okay, good.
If I may come in here.
Sure, from France.
Yeah, I slightly disagree that we would not be able to do that in Europe. Yes, I think it's hard. I think it's hard to get a good narrative because our own democracies are under fire right now, our systems, and I think we have to strengthen those, and we have to think hard about how we can deal with the challenges of our democratic systems. But let's say 10, 15 years ago, the European Union had a public diplomacy strategy and people working on this, and they let it go. And I think it's time that they start doing it again. And yes, it is a very different kind of public diplomacy than China's public diplomacy. Indeed, we have to let all those voices be heard abroad. But I think it is important not only to have our own narrative and why we feel our liberal system is working well. We feel more at home with that. But also in promoting it. And that is something where China is much better. So we think our idea speaks for themselves, and that is not the case. We have to actively promote them. And also coming back a little bit to the earlier discussion and the question about are there notions how we can get together with China? I think in that respect, it is really a pity that a real dialogue, a real good discussion with China is so difficult at the moment, because our democratic systems are having problems, and it would be actually very nice and maybe very helpful to discuss this with the Chinese side, with Chinese scholars, and see how we can maybe mend this, how we can improve our systems. And that is something that is really not possible at the moment. So China feels free to denounce our system, to highlight the shortcomings. But if we do it the other way around, in order to, well, openly discuss these shortcomings, China shies away. And I think that is really a pity. And maybe this is something we should work towards in the future. But with the current regime and the current climate, I do not see that happening anytime soon.
Very brief.
Yes. Now, I'm going to respectfully disagree here. I don't think we should be bothered too much about narratives at all. Yes, China's pouring billions into it, but all recent research suggests that they might as well just be shoving it down a furnace if you look at popular perceptions of China in third countries, right? Yes, they are putting a lot of money in narrative construction efforts, and frankly, it's unsuccessful. Never interrupt your adversary when they are making a mistake. But also, and this is our Western problem, we've gotten so caught up in this idea of politics as narrative that we've forgotten, right? We want sort of the bright, shiny, glittery thing. What we forgot is actually, if we want to be more successful in China, you have to do it in competence. And it's the daily boring grind of every day, again, delivering competent solutions for your people and for the rest of the world. And that's really what we need to get back good at. And, you know, narratives be damned.
Yeah, maybe I agree with the narrative part that's maybe too strong, but let me give an example. Raoul here last year with the COVID-19 aid that China gave to European countries, they promoted it. It was all over the newspapers, also locally in Europe. whereas European countries donated the same kind of help and nobody knew. So I think sometimes it is also for the European side good to promote a little bit more what they are doing and what kind of things work.
That's correct, but it's not a narrative. It's just, you know, the European Union or individual countries putting stuff on a plane and flying it somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Okay. This steps into a question put by Mr. Frédéric Poupati, and who's wondering, Malin, if there is a Chinese institute wondering on a decoding EU dictionary, or is that just plainly impossible because, as Mr. Poupati calls it, it is so messy and strategically disoriented?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not aware of such a project. I think it would be a great project.
Yeah.
I would certainly welcome that, and I could perhaps help if any Chinese think tank is interested in doing that. I think that would be a great sort of collaborative project as well.
Okay, well, maybe you should look. You should look at colleagues in China and see if there's any institute that would be willing to do so, and then we could have a separate session on that. That would be really, really nice. Okay.
If I can very briefly comment, I do not know of a dictionary, but what I do see, and I'm sure you, Malin, see the same, Raoul here too. They are discussing and analyzing and writing about our concepts all the time. There are hundreds of publications. So yes, they're doing it, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's even an internal kind of dictionary.
In my experience, having been involved in quite a few track 2 diplomatic processes, the Chinese delegation tends to have done their homework 100 times better than the European delegation. At the working level, the problem is once it gets through to higher levels of policy, you get into these, you know, we have caricatural views of China, they have caricatural views of us.
Yeah, okay. I think this is a very good note to end. I mean, especially I like the mirror situation that you're painting right here, and I think you're right. There are many other questions, but well, we want to stick to the time, an hour. So I hope those who did not get their responses are not too disappointed and will join us for a next session. We have had 2 sessions on this now, and it leads to a lot of questions. So no doubt we will find a new angle and then come back with you for discussing the topics that lay below or beyond this dictionary. In the meantime, I would like to thank our speakers. Malin, in the first place, we hope to be continuing our cooperation. Ingrid, I wish you a good, albeit short stay in France, and Rogier, who has been joining us here. I also would like to thank the audience. We're getting quite a few very nice compliments and comments on the usefulness of this session and the usefulness of the dictionary as well. So we will try to serve you in the future as well in this respect. And for now, I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. It's very sunny here in Leiden. The same with you, Malin, in Stockholm.
No, not so much today. Can I just add before everyone leaves that we really welcome suggestions and feedback on the dictionary. We see it as a living document, and there is a website for it that you should visit rather than sort of accessing it through the Raoul Wallenberg Institute website. You can go to decodingchina.eu. It's there in the chat now. And please suggest what other terms should we include. We're expanding the dictionary, so please give us your feedback, and we hope it can be a useful resource for everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Malin. Thank you again. Thank all of you. A pleasant afternoon, and hopefully, at least in Leiden, this good weather will continue. Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye.